billions of dollars flowing across borders, reshaping economies on multiple continents. This is the story of the United States and Canada's massive aid to Ukraine. But why did these North American countries pour so much money into a conflict thousands of miles away? And what effects did this financial support create, not just at home, but across the global economic landscape? Picture a war-torn country on the edge of Europe, fighting for its existence. Now imagine the world's superpower and its northern neighbor stepping in, giving tens of billions of dollars away. It's a high-stakes game where every move could tip the balance of global power and economic stability. This isn't just about military support. This decision has sent shockwaves through the US and Canadian economies, affecting everything from job markets to national debts. And the consequences are more far-reaching than you might think, affecting industries you'd never expect and influencing economic policies for years to come. Are you curious about how defense contractors in America are booming while inflation ticks up? Wondering how Canadian pension funds are being affected by their government's long-term commitments to Ukraine? This is the economic rabbit hole that connects North America to Eastern Europe, and in turn, to the global financial system. On February 24th, 2022, the world watched in shock as Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border. Within hours, explosions rocked Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other major cities, the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II had begun. As Ukraine scrambled to defend itself, Western leaders huddled in emergency meetings. A sovereign democracy was under attack, and the post-Cold War order hung in the balance. The United States and Canada quickly found themselves at the center of the international response. Why? Because in today's interconnected world, what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. For the US, as the world's foremost military and economic power, this was a pivotal moment. They saw it as a chance to reassert American leadership and counter Russian aggression. Canada, with its commitment to international order, was equally invested in the outcome. But how do you support a country under siege without directly entering the war? The answer: money. Lots of money. And with that money came a lot of economic consequences, both intended and unintended, that would ripple through North America and beyond. As the smoke cleared from the first day's attacks, the machinery of Western aid began to grind into motion. Within days, both the US and Canada announced their first aid packages to Ukraine. The US Congress, in a rare show of unity, quickly approved a $13.6 billion aid package. This initial sum was just the beginning. Over the coming months, the gates would open wider and wider. Canada, despite its smaller economy, was just as eager. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced an initial $100 million in humanitarian aid, quickly followed by promises of military equipment and financial support. This wasn't just about writing checks. Both countries had to navigate complex legal and logistical challenges to get the aid where it was needed most. Military equipment had to be shipped across the Atlantic, financial systems had to be set up to transfer funds, and safeguards had to be put in place to ensure the aid wasn't misused. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked around the clock to coordinate with European allies, international organizations, and Ukrainian officials. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the full weight of the US and Canadian governments. As the conflict dragged on, the scale of the aid grew to staggering proportions. By August 2024, the United States had committed over $75 billion in assistance to Ukraine. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of many countries. This aid came in various forms. There was direct military assistance, everything from small arms and ammunition to missile systems and armored vehicles. Financial aid helped prop up Ukraine's economy and government services. Humanitarian aid provided food, medicine, and shelter for millions of displaced Ukrainians. Canada, while operating on a smaller scale, still had pledged $4.5 billion in military assistance alone, with additional funds for humanitarian and economic support. For a country of Canada's size, this represented a significant portion of its foreign aid budget. But these figures only tell part of the story. The real impact of this aid, both on Ukraine and on the North American economies, was far more complex and far-reaching than most people realized. While the aid packages were primarily designed to help Ukraine, they had significant ripple effects back home in the US and Canada. First, there was the impact on the defense industry. The need to replace equipment sent to Ukraine, combined with increased military spending by NATO allies, led to a boom for defense contractors. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics saw their order books increase massively. This translated into job creation and economic growth in regions with strong defense industry presence. For example, General Dynamics Combat Systems increased its revenues by almost 25% compared to the previous year. The company planned to increase production of certain munitions by 7 times. Similarly, RTX, a manufacturer of missiles, received new orders for over $3 billion since February 2022. This defense industry boom had a multiplier effect on local economies. Small towns with defense manufacturing plants saw an influx of jobs and increased economic activity. Suppliers to these major defense contractors also benefited, creating a ripple effect through the manufacturing sector. However, this boom came with a cost. The massive aid packages put pressure on government budgets. In the US, debates raged over whether the aid to Ukraine was coming at the expense of domestic priorities. Some argued that the money could have been better spent on infrastructure, healthcare, or education at home. In Canada, similar discussions took place, though on a smaller scale. The country's commitment to Ukraine, while broadly supported, raised questions about the balance between international obligations and domestic needs. The aid also had implications for inflation. The increased government spending, combined with supply chain disruptions caused by the war, contributed to inflationary pressures in both countries. Central banks had to navigate the delicate balance of controlling inflation without stifling economic growth. The aid to Ukraine didn't just affect the home economy, it had global economic implications. By supporting Ukraine's defense, the US and Canada aimed to prevent further destabilization of Europe, which could have had severe consequences for the global economy. Consider the potential impact if the conflict had spread beyond Ukraine's borders. Disruptions to energy supplies, trade routes, and financial markets could have triggered a global recession. By helping to contain the conflict, the aid arguably prevented even greater economic damage. Moreover, the united Western response to Russian aggression sent a strong signal to financial markets. It demonstrated that major economies were willing to bear significant costs to uphold international norms, which helped maintain investor confidence despite the uncertainties of war. The aid also had significant implications for global trade patterns. Sanctions on Russia led to a reshuffling of energy markets, with European countries seeking new sources of oil and gas. This created opportunities for North American energy producers, but also led to increased energy prices globally. In agriculture, Ukraine's role as a major grain exporter was disrupted by the war.
Ukraine's agriculture minister announced today that the area in which the country's spring crop will be planted might shrink by more than half this year, compared with the levels expected before the Russian invasion. As a major exporter of wheat, other grains, and vegetable oils, this hit to Ukraine's production will affect the global food supply, and experts say drive up food prices, which were already at all-time highs.
This led to increased food prices globally, particularly affecting developing countries. The US and Canada, both major agricultural producers, saw increased demand for their exports, benefiting farmers, but also contributing to domestic food inflation. The massive flow of aid also had implications for currency markets. The need to convert dollars and Canadian dollars into Ukrainian hryvnia or euros for aid purposes led to increased currency trading volumes. This, combined with the economic uncertainties caused by the war, contributed to volatility in foreign exchange markets. As the conflict stretched on, it became clear that supporting Ukraine wasn't a short-term proposition. Both the US and Canada found themselves making long-term commitments that would shape their economic policies for years to come. In the US, the Biden administration proposed multi-year aid packages, signaling a sustained commitment to Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. This long-term outlook had implications for budget planning, tax policies, and even election campaigns. Canada, too, extended its commitments. The $4.5 billion military aid package announced in 2024 was designed to provide support through 2029. This long-term view required careful economic planning and raised questions about Canada's future role on the world stage. These extended commitments also had implications for domestic industries. Defense companies could plan for sustained production, potentially leading to increased investment and innovation. However, it also raised concerns about the opportunity costs of such prolonged military spending. The long-term nature of these commitments also had implications for government debt. Both countries had to grapple with how to finance these aid packages over multiple years without excessively increasing their national debts or tax burdens. While the initial outpouring of aid was met with broad public support, maintaining that support over the long term proved challenging. As the conflict dragged on and domestic economic pressures mounted, both the US and Canada faced unexpected hurdles. In the US, political divisions began to show. Some lawmakers, particularly in the Republican Party, started to question the continued large-scale aid to Ukraine.
The White House has promised Ukraine and all of its allies that more help is on the way, and yet now this is all tied up until the two sides can work out something on immigration, an issue that has divided them bitterly, Nora, for decades now.
They argued that the money could be better spent addressing domestic issues like border security or reducing the national debt. Canada faced its own set of issues. The country's close ties to Ukraine initially ensured strong public support for aid. However, as the economic impacts of the aid began to be felt, some Canadians began to question the extent of their country's commitment. Perhaps the biggest unexpected challenge was the need to balance support for Ukraine with efforts to prevent the conflict from escalating into a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. This delicate balancing act required careful diplomacy and sometimes meant limiting the types of aid provided to avoid crossing Russian red lines. The full economic impact of the massive aid to Ukraine is still unfolding. However, several key things have become clear. First, the aid has undoubtedly played a crucial role in Ukraine's ability to defend itself. While the human and material costs of the war have been enormous, Ukraine has managed to preserve its independence and territorial integrity, an outcome that seemed far from certain in the early days of the invasion. Second, the economic impacts on the US and Canada have been significant, but not catastrophic. The defense industry boom has offset some of the costs, and the prevention of a wider European conflict has likely saved both countries from even greater economic disruption. However, the long-term economic consequences are still changing. Both countries are dealing with increased national debt, and the opportunity costs of the massive aid packages will be debated for years to come. On the international stage, the willingness of the US and Canada to commit such substantial resources has reinforced their roles as key players in global security. It has strengthened NATO and other international alliances, potentially reshaping the global economic and security landscape for decades to come. In terms of global trade, the conflict and subsequent aid efforts have accelerated shifts in energy markets and food supply chains. This has created both challenges and opportunities for North American businesses, particularly in the energy and agricultural sectors. Perhaps most importantly, the aid to Ukraine has demonstrated the complex interplay between geopolitics and economics in the modern world. It has shown how events thousands of miles away can have direct impacts on jobs, prices, and government policies at home. Building on the complex relationship between geopolitics and economics, you might be wondering how some countries manage to thrive despite carrying huge national debt. Check out my video on how Japan maintains a strong economy while shouldering over $10 trillion in debt. It's a perfect example of how traditional economic rules don't always apply.